Hey there everyone, today I am going to be reviewing the Sophomore album by Bats. Bats are a post-punk band from Ireland that infuse their sounds with tons of progressive rock, math rock and really funky danceable beats. I actually first heard of Bats not too long ago and picked up their debut album, which I was actually really impressed with because the overall aesthetic and the overall sound was really kind of unique and refreshing in a way. And it took a mix of influences that I personally really enjoy. Although I didn't necessarily fall in love with this record, I did think it was really solid, and like I said, I was excited about their sound and wanted to see what they put out in the future. So needless to say, once this second album dropped, The Sleep of Reason, I grabbed it and I felt like Bats had really kind of stepped up their game in a lot of ways. Firstly, the production on this record is considerably better than their previous work. It has a slightly clearer recording quality. However, the main change that I was absolutely psyched about was the drastic increase in the level of detail on these songs. They are now really experimenting with a lot more sounds, a lot more textures. It has a more cohesive sound as well. Songwriting stepped up, drum performances stepped up. There's more off-kilter rhythms, more influences in the mix as well now. And that actually sort of deals with a gripe I had with the first album, which was that it was a teeny bit one-dimensional and a teeny bit repetitive. I felt like I was catching deja vu on a lot of the tracks. On this album, there's certainly a lot less of that, although I must admit it's still on this record to a certain degree. However, they're still a new band, so I can sort of forgive them for that in fairness. But anyway, the album opens with the track Emergent Properties, and this is essentially an intro track. It opens with what sounds like a kind of thumping heartbeat, and a guitar comes in striking a single, really unusual sounding chord. It's very scratchy in a sense, and this chord also echoes. As it builds, drums get more intricate and there's a nice build in the drums. I'm hearing a very weird, slightly eerie and odd sound in the mix. In fact, there's actually a couple of them just kind of hanging in the background, swooping in and out. As it gets to the end of the track, the post-punk sort of really comes into the forefront, and it gets quite noisy with lots of very heavy cymbal hits and that sort of thing. But once it gets to the climax of the build, it kicks straight in, wasting no time, to the second track, Wolf Wrangler. This track is the first actual track, and I feel like it's a great opener for the album. It really sort of sums up a lot of the album. It opens with a really great drum pattern, and it also has some really nice sound, and there's also a really nice sounding bizarre guitar riff. It opens very kind of math rocky with lots of bizarre rhythms, angular guitar playing all over the place. Eventually it sort of slows down and goes into this very dancey section. It's got lots of funky Rage Against the Machine-esque guitar, loads of guitar wailing kind of sounds in a very Tom Morello-esque way. Also, one other thing, I'm loving the way the bass sounds on this record. It's certainly a bit more clear than the previous one. It's very low end and heavy and very driving as well, but it's kept pretty warm and clean. It's not necessarily too dirty or anything like that. There are moments with this track where there is sort of a very light indie influence in the chords that are strummed. They're played incredibly quickly and played over the top of some really intense playing to create a kind of subtle but nice little atmosphere and texture that just sort of adds a little bit more detail and another layer to the mix. But what I really love about this track, that just carries on throughout the whole record and I could not be more excited about, is, like I said, the absolute plethora of different sounds and unique, interesting little textures that are just kind of hanging in the mix, and they really string this album together in a sense. I'm loving a lot of the lyrics on this record too. They're all very science-based, especially on the next track, Stem Cells, and this song, surprise surprise, is about stem cell research and how it's kind of a shame that it's looked down upon by so many people and unallowed in so many places around the world. However, once again, this track sports a very post-punk influence and is not ashamed of really cracking on with those riffs that sound great. By the next track, Astronomy Astrology, the influence sort of really come into the clear. I'm hearing a lot of sort of early Infinityland era Biffy, hints of Fall of Troy as well in the mix. During the dancier, more synth-orientated sections, I'm hearing a lot of battles, more so in nature though, I must admit. This album is just very playful and very bright in nature. Another thing that's demonstrated on this track, a lot more so than a lot of the tracks, although the other tracks definitely had it as well, is another step up in songwriting. It's got a super catchy hook, it just sounds really great, it flows really well. However, on the subject of songwriting, I will say there are moments where this album does feel somewhat disjointed. It kind of feels like the pieces are forced together a little bit. One example of that on a track would be the song Creature Collecting, Although the track is a really great track, it opens with a very nice jittery guitar that kind of plays a riff and stutters almost like a broken record. But like I said, it kind of has a couple of issues with songwriting. It feels like there are parts that are just not quite flowing correctly or not really moving in the way the band want them to on this track. I will say there are moments on this LP where they definitely master that sort of bizarre songwriting in the sense of tempo changes that don't really feel forced together. They flow very naturally despite being so off-kilter and slightly off-putting at first. Also, I just want to talk a little bit about the influences on this record. I'm hearing quite a bit of Biffy and quite a bit of Fall of Troy, especially in the vocals. But the reason I mention Biffy is because it has that very alt-rock kind of feel to it. And also, like I said, it just kind of sounds like Biffy vocally at times. I will say this band really write choruses that sound very Fall of Troy-ish, especially in the vocals. And a lot of the instrumentation on this record, and a lot of the guitar work on this record is very sort of widdly and fast, but keeping it melodic and catchy despite being so technical, very much like Fall of Troy. Earlier on, I said this band kind of has some Battles influences too. Like I said, that's mostly in the more playful, electronic-y type sections of this album, but they're definitely there, especially when the band's sort of playing very dancey sections and beats. Despite not being quite as sugary and playful and full of energy as Battles, it's certainly got a lot of those qualities about it. Again, at times this band really sound like Rage Against the Machine, especially on some of these riffs. They're just super driving, have loads of experimentation in guitar effects and stuff like that. And the playing on this record, a lot of the time, just really reminds me of Tom Morello's riff writing. I must say, the last two tracks are probably my two favourites on this record. Luminthorous Aether has a very nice reverbed riff and a lovely guitar melody playing in the background that feels really floaty, and I'm just loving the texture of it. It eventually kicks in and the low end bass really changes the feel of this track, but the melodic side is definitely still there in the background and maintains that very floaty kind of playful feel. One thing that surprised me is the chorus on this track, unlike the rest, is super hard hitting, and it has a very obvious but sudden break that is actually a part of the chorus, and it works really well. The last track is a 10-minute closer. It's called Terrible Lizards, and it opens with this really nice guitar melody and bass line to back it up that kind of reminds me of the previous track in their very floaty and playful sense, despite being slightly slower. Eventually the drums start playing a really straightforward solid groove, just your average 4/4 groove. However, it's built upon in a way that kind of brings it away from that style of drum writing, really. Once again, there is plenty of hanging detail in the background, lots of really bizarre synth textures, lots of just generally odd sounds. I will say, compared to the rest of the album, it's actually not the busiest of intros or the busiest of sections even, really. There are other moments on this album where there's tons and tons of effects coming in from every angle, but that is certainly an aspect of this track. I will say though, this track goes for a slightly more atmospheric opening, which is probably why it's not as busy. However, throughout the track, it comes in with a lot of great sounds, and it is again a very busy track in terms of variation of sounds as well. It's absolutely packed with really great drum fills and the very bizarre vocals that are all over this album. This track ends at around 6 minutes in, and I love the way they outro this album. The last 4 minutes of the track is this very low end ambient sound that comes in. It starts off incredibly quiet and sort of builds and builds. It's a very eerie outro to such a playful album, but it doesn't feel out of place at all. And it also doesn't feel truly eerie, I just mean that in context with this album. It still has those weird sounds all over the place. One of them kind of sounds like a siren to a degree. And I think this is what keeps the outro consistent, and this is what keeps it feeling like Bats. Around halfway through this outro, there's a very sudden burst of really noisy energy that doesn't really have any solid groove to it. It's just very sudden, hard hitting. After this, it kicks in sort of a drum groove on the toms. There's no vocals, only a really low-end guitar drone and some really bizarre sounds over the top, and eventually this just sort of fades out. Ultimately, I was just really impressed with this album, I must admit, which was kind of a surprise for me because I didn't expect this band to get so much better than they actually did. I think I've pretty much touched down on all the criticisms, but I'll just kind of point them out here. I do feel like this album on the whole could have been a teeny bit more varied in terms of songwriting and in terms of sounds, really, despite the fact they covered a broad array of sounds. and also despite the fact the songwriting was definitely better, I still feel like it could have varied a bit more than it actually did. Overall, it has a very cohesive sound, but I must admit it is perhaps just a teeny bit too cohesive, which kind of adds to the previous problem. But to be perfectly honest, aside from that, I don't really have any criticisms of this album really. It's a really great album. It will definitely end up being one of my favourites this year, and it's almost definitely, to me, the most fun and playful release this year. It's pretty much the first thing I've reviewed that hasn't been automatically dark and gritty, with the exception of the Biffy Clyro track review, and also perhaps a couple of others that I can't really remember, but there you go. Anyway, I think I'm going to call it here, because I really cannot fault this record, and I've listed all my positives previously. I'm feeling an 8 out of 10 on this record. It's a really great record. If you haven't heard it or haven't heard of Bats, definitely go check them out if you're into anything from math rock to post-punk. Also, if you enjoy any of the influences I mentioned throughout this video, go check them out. You'll really like this band. Quite honestly, I can't think of anyone that wouldn't like this band. If you like music with guitars in it, you'll like this band and this album. You need to check it out. Seriously, do it. But anyway, I'm going to call it here. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment and subscribe. Make sure you let me know what you thought of this record if you've heard it. And I'll catch you guys and gals later.